had these 3 picture frames in my stash for quite a while now, and I know you can find very similar ones at Dollar Tree. I'm not sure where these ones came from, but I'm gonna remove the backs of these, and then I got out some foam core board. I'm gonna cut around the backing with my X-Acto knife so I have a piece of the foam core board that fits snugly inside the frames. Next, I'm taking some masking tape and I want to tape off all along the edges. I didn't put the tape directly up against the edge. I wanted to kind of cut the tape in half, just to get a white border that was the size that I wanted all the way around the foam core board. Then I'm taking my moss green paint by Waverly and I'm using a sponge dauber here to apply all over the foam core board. I just really like the texture and the dimension that using a sponge dauber added to the paint rather than using a flat brush. And again, use whatever color makes you happy here and go with your aesthetic. I gave all 3 foam core boards 2 coats of the green paint. Then I got out my Rub and Buff. I really wanted to give these frames more of a vintage type of look. I have the colors Antique Gold, European Gold, and Gold Leaf. I wanted to see which one I liked against that black frame, so I did a little test section on the back. I ended up going with that Antique Gold because it felt the brightest against the black frame. The other 2 felt a little bit more sheer. To apply Rub and Buff, you can simply just use your finger. It does stain a little bit and you might need to use some rubbing alcohol or something to take it off of your hand with. I like to use a makeup brush here because it's really soft and it blends the Rub and Buff in nicely. It also helps to spread it a lot farther. I covered all 3 frames with about 1.5 coats of the Rub and Buff. I didn't want a full coverage here, but wanted that black to peek through in a little bit for an aged look. When I went to remove the masking tape from the foam core board, I should have known it was going to rip off some of that foam core board top. After all, it is just paper as the top layer. And at first I was really upset by this. However, I think it turned out to be a really happy accident because it ended up giving even more of that aged and vintage type of look that I was going for in the first place. So once I stepped back to take a look at how they had turned out, I really loved it. I did just have to touch up one small section where the paper ripped up a little too far. Next, I had cut out a few greenery images with my Cricut machine, and I'm gonna weed them out now. So I cut a Monstera leaf and then 2 basic greenery stem looking images. And of course, you can print out any image that fits your style. Vintage botanical art has been trending for a while, and I wanted to recreate that look for myself. Once I got my images weeded, I'm just taking some clear contact paper. I prefer using this over transfer tape. I find that it's a little bit less sticky and doesn't rip off my paint when I'm applying it to the vinyl. I know you can use the t-shirt trick, but I just don't love using that method and really prefer the contact paper. Then I laid my botanical art in the center of the foam core board and removed that contact paper. You could use even larger frames to make this really impactful or create a whole gallery wall for your space in your home. I really love the way these turned out. I just pop them right back in their frame and they're good to go to hang on the wall. I've had this magazine box in my stash for years, just waiting for an idea to come to mind. I found it at the Goodwill back when their prices were still reasonable, and today I'm finally giving it a makeover. Now, it wouldn't be one of my videos without some type of struggle, right? So here we go. I wanted to add layers of milk paint to this box using a dark green and a cream color. Milk paint is very unpredictable, which I'm realizing just doesn't work for me. It comes in a powder form and you add warm water to create the paint. You mix 1 part of the powder to 1 part of warm water and mix it up for 2 minutes. What makes milk paint unpredictable is the way that it cracks and chips. You can put an additive into it to make it adhere better, but then it doesn't really get that old chippy paint look that is what I wanted. This box has a slick surface, which also causes the milk paint to chip and not stick to it. I should have sanded it down before adding the paint, but I wanted to see how it would react to a surface like this. I also used my heat gun on the wet paint, which caused it to chip even more. This ended up being a pretty big mess. The first layer was okay, but the more I added, the more it chipped and took off all of those layers underneath. Next, I added a coat of the cream milk paint, and again, it was chipping way more than I wanted it to. So I had the brilliant idea to add a sealer to the paint. I thought if I add a matte top coat and then put the milk paint on top of that, it should help it chip less, right? You guys, all the sealer did was reactivate the milk paint and cause even more chipping. Like I said, this thing made a mess, so it's time for plan B. I painted the box in the color Drop Cloth by Dixie Belle, but you could see all those chipped areas since it was not smooth and I really didn't feel like sanding the whole thing down. So for the second coat of paint, I added in baking soda to give it texture and hide those chipped areas. If you stipple the baking soda paint onto the surface, it adds that stucco-like texture. While I was in the middle of creating this project, IOD came out with their new spring release. And when I saw the mushroom mold, I literally called up my local stockist right away to hold one for me and went and picked it up. Mushrooms are super trendy right now in home decor, so I had the idea to add a little mushroom garden scene to the bottom of this box. I wasn't sure how exactly I was going to lay out the mushrooms, so I made more than one of each to have some variety. One thing I love about these molds is that micro rim, which makes getting the excess clay off super easy, and just look at all that detail. Next, I figured out how I wanted to lay them out on the box and used my Titebond glue again to attach them. I glued the mushrooms on while the clay was still wet. So even though this is a flat surface, it still works out better to glue them down wet to ensure they form to the piece. Once the clay was dried, I'm taking this Fusion mineral paint in the color Lichen to paint them. This is the first time I've used this paint brand and I really liked it. The color was perfect for these mushrooms. I also painted the inside of the box with the same color to tie it all together.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future future is bright.
Then once the paint dried, I added a white wax on top to bring out all those details in the mold.
We don't need no more. Even in the hard times, you and I can weather any storm.
So while this project took a very different turn from my original vision, sometimes things don't work out for a reason, because I absolutely love how this turned out. Had this idea for over a year and just haven't done it yet. I got these chopping mats from the Dollar Tree and they are see-through. One side's kind of frosted looking and the other is shiny. I want to decoupage the mat and I grabbed two options from my stash. One's a decoupage paper and the other is a basic tissue paper that was a little bit more colorful. Both options are stunning and very spring feeling, but I thought you could see the print and pattern a little bit better on the blue florals, so I went with that one. Since the decoupage paper wasn't as tall as the chopping mat, I had to cut it down a little bit. I used my X-Acto knife to cut it down, and it was really easy to cut through. Guess that wouldn't really make it a good chopping mat, though. I then cut the mat in half because I'm making a little light box or a lantern, and it needs 4 sides. Next, I wiped down the surface of the mat. Since we're decoupaging the paper to the back, or the shiny side, I wanted to make sure there was no fingerprints or dust that got trapped and you would see them from the other side. I'm going to use my liquid patina to glue the paper onto the mat, but I actually think Mod Podge or decoupage glue would have been a little bit better for this project specifically. Decoupage paper is pretty thick, much thicker than when you use a napkin, and the liquid patina dries quickly. I used a fan brush to apply the glue so it would get up under the paper easily and apply the glue to all of the areas. I wasn't thinking when I did this first one, I had wanted to add both mats to the paper before cutting the paper down, but I had only added the one mat at first, so I had to cut this one down, but for the second paper, I added both mats and glued them at the same time. As the glue was drying, I realized I could see some streaks under the paper. It was like the areas that had more glue turned the paper more transparent, and the thinner glue areas stayed whiter. So I went back over top of the whole thing with a layer of the patina. I sanded off all the excess paper, and here's why I would have used a thicker glue like Mod Podge. You can see the paper peeling away from all the corners. I had to add more patina to make sure it stays down. Next, we need to build the lantern structure. I was able to create a rectangle with the Jenga blocks without having to cut down any of them again. Winning! I made 4 rectangles, and then before I added the decoupage mats, I want to paint them. I wanted the lantern to have a ton of texture, so I added baking soda to my paint. And I added a lot of baking soda. The way I like to get the most texture by using this method is by painting the first coat on how you normally would paint something. And then when you add the second coat, or however many coats you want after, you stipple it on. I love this technique. It is kind of hard to tell on camera here, but I'll make sure to get a close-up in the reveal. Once the paint was all dry, I'm adding decoupage mats onto the blocks with hot glue. The one thing you want to be cognizant of here is that you are gluing the frosted side down, so that's what you see on the outside of the lantern. That way you don't have the paper texture facing out. Next, I assembled the lantern and glued all 4 sides together. I realized after I put everything together, I needed a base for inside of the lantern, because I'm going to add some feet and I need something to put the light on. So I glued some blocks together. They don't fit perfectly on the bottom, but that's okay. You're not going to see this part. I just painted them white as well, but not with the texture paint. It was a little difficult to get the blocks glued in. I had dry fitted it and it was pretty snug, so of course when I went to actually glue it in, one side didn't want to cooperate. But I left it as is. Like I said, you aren't going to see this part. And last, I grabbed these little feet that I have. I think these are from Hobby Lobby, and I glued them onto the base. I like how they looked being in a little bit from the edge. I just love how this project turned out. I think it is so stunning, and even more so than I had envisioned. I'm using a ceramic pumpkin that I got from Hobby Lobby. I love the lumpy, uneven surface of this pumpkin, but not the Hello Fall words engraved on it. I just personally don't love words on my decor, but if you like that, you can certainly leave it as is. I'm going to use joint compound to fill them in. I started out using a putty knife, but it was leaving behind a lot of additional joint compound, and I didn't want to have to sand this thing forever. So I wiped off the excess with a paper towel and then used my fingers to make sure the letters were all filled in, then set it aside to dry. Once it was dry, I sanded down the surface. I was actually kind of surprised at how well this had worked. I thought for sure you would still be able to see the letters. But sanding the surface took some of that existing finish off, so then I painted it with the color Drop Cloth by Dixie Belle. Now comes the tedious part. I found this beautiful fall napkin at Hobby Lobby as well, but I didn't want to just cover the surface with the whole thing. I think that would have caused a lot of wrinkles and be a little bit difficult to make it look nice. So I started to cut out the individual leaves. This way I could also arrange them how I wanted. To apply the leaves, I'm using my liquid patina from DIY Paint. I really like this stuff as a decoupage glue. It has a thin consistency and dries quickly. I like to use a small paintbrush and then add a thin layer of the liquid patina under the section I'm gluing down. Then use my paintbrush to push the napkin piece onto the pumpkin. I know this seems really tedious and time consuming, which it is, but the outcome is just so gorgeous. I ended up mixing in some Dollar Tree rub-on transfers as well to show you can get that same look with these. Once I was happy with how covered the pumpkin was, I painted the stem brown. I didn't want it to be just a flat brown though, so then I took my bronze gilding wax to highlight the ridges of the stem. You can also use Rub 'n Buff or even a metallic paint to get that same look. And that's it for this one. It is just absolutely stunning and looks so high-end for fall. Found these textured candles and diffuser set, and we all know I love textures. Now I'm not going to make this whole set, I'm just taking inspiration from it. At first I had the idea to wrap clay around a vase and then carve into the clay, but clay shrinks as it dries. That would have caused a lot of cracking, So instead, I decided to create the whole thing solely out of clay. I bought this 10-pound box of clay last summer and still had plenty left to work with. I rolled a chunk out into a slab and used these decorative molding pieces that I had to keep the clay the same width. Then I cut out 6 pieces, 2 5 by 5 inch squares and 4 1.5 by 5 inch rectangles. I built my bud vase, adding 2 of the rectangle sides onto the square front. When you connect pieces of clay together, you want to score and slip it so they have a strong bond and don't crack apart as they dry. So I scored the edge of both pieces being connected and added some slip, which is clay mixed with water. This acts as a glue. I realized my slip is a different color. I had grabbed the wrong one by accident, but that's okay, you don't even see it in the end. Then when you have this side together, you also need to blend out the seam where they meet. So I was taking a clay tool and pushing the clay up and down between the 2 pieces until there was no seam and the side was smooth. I did the same process to apply the second square side, but because the clay is super wet and moldable at this point, I needed to put something inside to hold it up. This 2x4 wood piece was almost the perfect depth, so I used this. I know I'm kind of flying through this part, but that's because I'm no expert when it comes to creating ceramics or clay vessels, and I don't think you guys are interested in an in-depth tutorial here. I let the clay dry for a bit until it would stand on its own and not collapse. And then I removed the block and added an opening for the neck of the bud vase. Alright, now that this is built, I let it dry for several days. It was probably a week before I came back to it. Next, I painted the whole thing black and gave it 2 coats. I'm using DIY paint in Black Velvet here, but you could use any color and any brand, that part doesn't matter. The only thing I would keep in mind here is we're going to scratch the surface to reveal the clay underneath. This is a terracotta clay, so I made sure I would like the 2 colors together. It didn't take long at all for the paint to dry against the clay. Then I got out some more of my clay tools to start carving the paint away and revealing that clay underneath. I went back and forth using a few different clay tools to do this. I didn't want a super uniform and perfect look, and the different tools gave slightly different results. The one tool would take a larger chunk out of the clay and combine 2 of my lines that I was adding, and I actually liked how that looked and wanted it to be sporadic all over the piece. I etched the bud vase around the front and the 2 sides. Ideally, I would do the back as well, but this took such a long time to do it, and my hand was really cramping up, so I ignored the back today. But I really love how this piece turned out, even more so that I created the whole thing from scratch. Project is oddly hard, but easy. I recently found these large dowels at the Dollar Tree, and I've had this wood circle in my stash, also from the Dollar Tree. The dowels come in a pack of 2, and we need 3 for this project, although you could use 4 if you wanted. I was inspired by this modern plant stand, and this one has 4 legs. I just wanted to make mine with 3, but my version is also much smaller. I have this little white IKEA planter pot that fits perfectly on the circle, so I then found out how tall I wanted the dowel to be against the planter. It was difficult to figure out how to get the legs on. I knew I wanted to use wood glue so the bond would be strong, but it was not easy attaching a dowel to the edge of a circle. I fumbled around with it for quite a while and then got a clamp out to hold it in place. I had to let each leg dry in place before adding on the next, So when it was time to add the next leg on, I measured the circumference of the circle so I knew where to put the next two, and they would be evenly spaced. Then I got out my mini level to make sure the plant stand is functional and I don't glue one of the legs on slightly higher than another. I also had the genius idea to add a dab of hot glue to hold it in place while I got the clamp on. Now, why didn't I think of that sooner? Who knows? Better late than never though, right? I did the same thing for the third leg, which was the easiest one to put on. Then, once the last leg was dried, I'm painting the whole thing with my bronze patina paint by Dixie Belle. I don't plan on adding the patina spray here to distress or age this piece. I just wanted that metal look that was similar to the Pottery Barn version. Week, I melted down a few Dollar Tree candles and saved the jars to create some cute little bud vases. First, I need to clean out the remaining wax residue, and I used my heat gun to do that. This remelted the wax and allowed it to drip down to the bottom, and then I just wiped it out with a paper towel. So for this first one, I grabbed my polymer clay and rolled it out, not paying much attention to the shape of it. I just want to make sure that it's thick enough to hold its shape. Then I cut it down into a thin strip and applied it to the side of the glass jar. I've been seeing a few pottery designs like this on my Pinterest feed lately and wanted to give it a shot. The clay sticks pretty well to the glass on its own. I do go back and add some glue here in a little bit, but I wanted to get all the pieces on first. I pinched the outer edge of the clay all the way down to start creating that ripple look. Once I got all the pieces on, I'm taking this Sculpey oven bake adhesive and added it all along the edge of each clay strip. Not too much, just enough to make sure it stays on the glass. And I kind of wiggled the clay a little bit to make sure the glue got underneath of it. Then I put the jar into the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 minutes. Then you want to turn the oven off and let it gradually cool down inside. The next day, once the glass was cooled off, I painted everything in this sandy blonde color by DIY Paint and gave it 3 coats. When painting glass, you want to let each coat fully dry before adding that next coat. Otherwise, you'll lift up some of that previous paint layer. Now, I was debating if I wanted to leave it this solid color or add some white wax to it, and I landed on adding the white wax. I always scoop out a little bit of the wax onto a popsicle stick, that way my brush doesn't contaminate it or get any of that colored paint into the wax. I added the white wax to a few sections and then wiped it off with a dry paper towel. Let me know in the comments, which version did you prefer, the solid tan or with the white wax? I really like how it looks with the wax. Project, I'm using these scrap 1x2 pieces that I have from attempting to make a privacy screen over the summer. I had stained the wood and then decided to cut a foot of it off, so I had these 1-foot sections left over. Now, this project is not difficult, but it does require a miter saw or a way to cut a 30-degree angle. I'm making a wood tree, and all of these pieces will have the same angle on both sides. Next, I figured out how long I need my first bottom piece of the tree to be, and I will pop all the measurements on the screen in a minute. My saw has a laser on it, which is super helpful in cutting a piece like this because my line is showing the full length of the piece, but since I need to cut it at an angle, I need to start a little bit further back from that line. If you don't have a laser, you can cut the wood longer and then slowly cut away at it until you have the length that you need. I wanted to paint the trees using my milk paint. I have 2 different brands here, and this was the first time that I had tried the Fusion brand. In the past, I haven't cared for milk paint, but wanted to give a different brand a shot to compare. Milk paint is typically used to get a weathered and chippy paint look, and I've always tried to force it to work. This time I decided to just let the paint do its thing, and however it turns out, great. I'm using an off-white color for one tree and then a green for the second. I ended up having to put 3 coats of the white on. I wasn't expecting the paint to chip much because the paint that was already on the wood is a deck over paint, which is thick and coarse. Milk paint needs more of a slick surface with less adhesion for it to crack, but the white Fusion brand milk paint actually did chip a little bit. When I sanded it down, the chipping was pretty much just on the corners and the edges, so the scrap wood pieces ended up looking slightly worn and distressed. I like how they turned out. The green ones didn't chip, but I still sanded them smooth, and you can see a little bit of the brown paint underneath show through. Alright, now we can put the tree together. I'm using wood glue for the best hold and gluing the longer 6-inch piece to one of the 5-inch pieces. The 30-degree angle should line right up and rest against the longer piece, which creates the top of the tree. I set that aside to set up for a minute, moved on to glue the bottom of the tree. Here you take the 10-inch piece and 2 of the 5-inch pieces that will go on either side. The angles should line up so that the 5-inch pieces are sitting flush with the bottom of that 10-inch piece. And again, I set this section aside to start drying. Once I was able to pick up the top and the bottom and the glue wasn't sliding around, I can add on the last 2 5-inch pieces. I want to make sure they are evenly placed on either side and measure the distance between the 2 ends. Then I added glue to the flat surface, and before I squeezed the pieces together, I measured one last time. This way I can easily move it into place if I'm a little bit off. And the last piece to glue down is the 4-inch piece that will be the trunk. I was pretty spot on in eyeballing it to the center, but still measured it just in case. Then just to touch up some of the areas where you could see the glue, I took my leftover milk paint and brushed it on top. That's it for this one. You could decorate them further and add some pine picks or ornaments, but I wanted to keep mine minimal. I was perusing the aisles of Hobby Lobby as I like to do when I'm trying to find inspiration for videos, and I came across this gallery glass in the stained glass area. I love trying new hobbies and exploring new mediums, so I picked up several things in this aisle for today's video, including some of the stained glass panels. I picked up a gallery glass blank, which is like plexiglass material. You also have to remove a film on both sides, and then you're left with this clear blank surface. I found a free printable stained glass pattern of a bird and printed that out. I will link this in my description box if you're interested, and this is what I'm going to use for my faux stained glass image. I taped the blank over top of the bird so that I can trace the image. I'm going to use the gallery glass leading again to outline the bird and add in his details. I thought there was a few too many lines on this bird, so I didn't add all of them on my version. But a tip I learned while doing some research on this project, you want the leading to look thick and three-dimensional on the surface. So you don't want to hold the tip of the nozzle directly on the surface. Instead, you want to start the line and then lift the nozzle off the surface a little and then drag your hand where you want the line to go and it will follow. I hope that makes sense. I tried to get a close-up for you to see. I know it's a little bit blurry, but if you hold the nozzle directly on the surface, you'll end up with a flatter and likely more shaky looking lead line. Now you want to let the lead lines dry before applying the colors. The next day I filled in the bird, and at first I was lightly filling in the shapes, not putting enough of the gallery glass paint down. I ended up having to add a second layer to the entire bird. So you want to make sure you're adding a good amount of the gallery glass or colored Mod Podge. You should not be able to see any glass through the paint. I also wasn't really making a pattern with the paint. You'll see here in a minute what I mean by that, but you want to make swirling motions with the nozzle to get that ripple-like texture of stained glass. I wanted there to be a little more detail on the branch, so I added the non-frosted brown first as my main color. And then I took my toothpick, dipped in the frosted brown, and added some detail lines to make it look like bark. I don't know how much you can see of this from far away, but up close it looks pretty cool. I let this dry before moving on to the background, and I'm using crystal clear to get that textured glass look. This time I realized I needed to create the texture as I was adding the paint. So I squeezed the tube and started moving my hand in a circular motion to get that look. My good friend Brandy over at the DIY Struggle recently did a Mod Podge swirl technique to get a faux stained glass look, and it looks very similar to the way this turns out. So like I said earlier, I'm pretty sure you can just use Mod Podge and save yourself some money. But you want to make sure you continue your swirls and your pattern going in the same direction all the way around the piece. I was kind of making ovals that were horizontal to my bird, and then I almost spun the glass and started making my swirls vertical to the bird. That would have looked funny in the end and would have been obvious that it's fake. I also tried not to make any area look too much like a pattern. If I thought it was starting to look too uniform, I went back over it with the nozzle and broke up that section. Alright, now I thought this looked a little bit plain left how it is. I had these Dollar Tree beaded wreath rings in my stash and thought that would be a really cute border around my bird. So I hot glued it down right on top. It was the perfect size. The only thing I don't love about the Dollar Tree wreath is how you can see that metal clasp right in the middle. So I made sure I glued it down with that part in the middle where I would hang it. Then I took some more Dollar Tree beads from a beaded garland and created a loop that covered up this metal clasp. What do you guys think of this technique? Would you give the faux stained glass look a try? This is just like an adult version of a sun catcher. This time using a large 5-gallon paint bucket from the paint I used on my deck. I'm going to take some pool noodles and cut them down to fit around the outside of the bucket. Then I cut the pool noodles in half to make them thinner and less bulky for when we add them onto the bucket. Now because the top of the bucket has those ridges and the lip that sticks out further from the bottom, I needed to add something to the bottom to make them the same depth. I took apart this old Scandinavian style light fixture that I made a few years ago and used the rows of Jenga blocks as spacers around the bucket. Next, I can add on the pool noodles, and I started at the top because I wanted to make sure the lid would still fit back on. I also thought it would look better to make sure that there was a full pool noodle at the top and it wouldn't need to be cut down at all. You want to be careful when using hot glue on a pool noodle. It will melt right through that material. So I would add a dab of hot glue and then hold the pool noodle in place until the glue cooled down. That way it wouldn't start to pull away from the bucket. And I didn't add glue onto every inch where the pool noodle touched the bucket, only every so often to hold its shape. Once you get to the end, if your pool noodle's too long, it is easy to just cut off the excess. I had to do that most of the time, but I'd rather have the noodles too long than too short. At the bottom, there was a gap and it wasn't big enough to fit another pool noodle. I didn't want to cut one down either. I thought that would look silly. So instead, I cut down some poster board to create about a 1-inch solid section at the bottom. Next, I'm going to cover the pool noodles with fabric. So I got out my flexible tape measure to figure out the length of the fabric that I need. I did make sure to tuck the tape measure in between each pool noodle so I could account for the fabric that would be tucked in as well. I'm going to start the fabric where the pool noodles meet so that all the seams are on the back side. Then I'm taking my hot glue to apply the fabric to the bottom part of the bucket where the poster board is. I applied the hot glue and then it kind of tucked the fabric up underneath of the bottom pool noodle. That way it has a nice clean finish along the bottom. Now, in order to see the fluted sides or the ridges that the pole noodles create, I'm taking embroidery floss and tying it really tight around the fabric. It's tucked in between the noodles and you cannot see it from the outside. And again, I tied the knot on the back side just to make sure all those messy bits are contained in one area. At the top of the bucket, I hot glued the fabric down around the rim and then I cut off any of the excess. I was still figuring out what I wanted to do as the top, so next I decided to paint the poster board black. And I'm using my black 3.0, which is marketed as the blackest black in the world. It has a very unique texture to it and almost feels velvety. I did a whole comparison of this project in a Halloween video last year that I'll link in the description box, but I put 2 coats of this paint on the poster board. I figured out what I wanted to do with the top. I've had this wood round lying around from an old project and it's the perfect size to make this a little ottoman side table. I didn't want to just paint the wood round, so instead I got out my Dollar Tree faux leather fabric. Now, the one downside to using the Dollar Tree faux leather is that it isn't quite wide enough to cover the wood round. I had to use 2 sheets so you can see a seam on the top of the table. It really didn't bother me, but you could always use a larger fabric piece or even just paint it. I measured out 2 inches from the edge of the wood round onto the back of the fabric. This will be enough to cover the sides and staple it down underneath. I wanted to make sure where the seams meet was nice and tight on the wood round since I can't just tug at the fabric from both sides. So I got out my Mod Podge and I glued the fabric down. I paid close attention to where the 2 fabric pieces meet to try and get it as seamless as possible, but you can definitely still see it. I let the Mod Podge dry and then started to secure the fabric down to the back. I wasn't thinking at first and started using hot glue. That was a terrible idea, but I'm glad that I didn't get too far before I realized the staple gun would work much better. When stapling fabric onto a round surface, you want to pick a point to start at. I started where the 2 fabric pieces meet. Then you want to take it section by section. Don't just go around the circle. You want to pick another point maybe a few inches down and staple that. From there, you want to pull at the fabric in the middle of your 2 stapled points and secure that down. Then work your way in towards your starting points. I hope that makes sense, but this will give you a seamless, smooth look from the front without any puckering on the edges. Just keep tugging and pulling at the fabric, working it to be smooth and secure it with a staple. And if the staple doesn't go all the way in, which happens sometimes, just take a hammer and pound it in. And that's it for this one. I left the inside of the bucket plain, but you could line it with fabric or paint to finish it a little bit more. I love how this turned out, and you would never guess it started out as a 5-gallon paint bucket. Beautiful handcrafted brass heart sculpture on the Pottery Barn site and thought it would be a fun challenge to see if I could create something similar. Now, I'm not going to use real brass for my piece, but instead I'm using wire and clay. This is 16 gauge wire, and again, I brought the image up on my phone so I could follow the same shape. I used about 60 inches of the wire and bent it until I was happy with how it was looking. This was a little difficult because the sculpture was made from one piece and molded into the 2 hearts. So I shaped one heart and then a second slightly larger while using my needle nose pliers to help shape it. Then I wrap the end of the wire around the start of the hearts. Next, I got out my Craftsmart polymer clay. You can get this brand at Michael's, but any brand will work. I would actually suggest using a darker color clay, preferably black, but didn't think about that at first. I conditioned and warmed up the clay by rolling it out and folding it several times. This takes a little bit of time until the clay is workable, and then I rolled it out into a long snake and started to mold it around the wire. The more you work with the clay, the warmer it gets, which makes shaping it become a little bit difficult. You can put the piece in the fridge or freezer for a few minutes to stiffen the clay back up a little bit if it becomes too hard to work with. I should have done that because by the end the clay was so bendable that you could see a lot of dents and bumps in the piece from where I was holding it. But that's okay, it just has a real handmade look, which is what I was going for. Once the clay was wrapped around the wire, I did my best to smooth it out and hide any seams, and then I put it into the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. Then you want to turn the oven off and leave the piece inside to slowly cool down. I left it in the oven overnight since it was later in the day anyways. Here's how it looks the next day, and now I'm going to spray paint it black, but if you use black clay, this step wouldn't be necessary. Now to make it look like brass, I'm taking my Rub and Buff in the color Gold Leaf. This is such a cool and unique product, and a little bit goes such a long way, but it does dry down pretty quickly. So I found it was easier to squeeze the tube and dab my brush into the tube rather than put some out on my work surface. You want to make sure you really buff and work the wax into the surface of your project. I used 2 different makeup brushes because they have soft bristles but are still firm. So I used one to apply the product and one to really buff it out. I ended up adding 2.5 layers of the Rub and Buff on top. I had wanted to use 2 different gold colors, but unfortunately the European gold one that I ordered didn't come in time for this video. But I plan on using this technique on my kitchen makeover and want to use the 2 colors on my drawer pulls and sink faucet. Those videos will be coming up soon. For the base of my sculpture, I had these Dollar Tree foam dice and glued 2 of them together and then painted them black. Now, to attach the sculpture on top, I simply used hot glue. A stronger adhesive would probably be better, but this worked well for me, and that's it for this one. Again, I had all these supplies already on hand, and the Pottery Barn version cost $129. I think this turned out pretty darn good, but what do you think? Would you attempt to make a sculptural piece like this? For this project, I'm making a fall-colored macrame wall hanging, and I'm adding it to this stick that I grabbed from my backyard. I scraped all the bark off and then bleached it to lighten the color a bit. But first I need to determine where the loop hanging portion is going to sit so I know how long the macrame cords need to be. I'm creating a spiral knot and didn't have a lot of the green cord left, so I decided to use a white cord as the inside part of the knot, since I have a lot of this color. But the length of my color cords is 240 inches or 610 centimeters, and the white cords are 130 inches or 330 centimeters. I'm adding 2 white cords to the branch with a lark's head knot, and then the green cord will go around the 2 white cords. I tape the branch down now so it doesn't move around on me, and like I said, I'm using 1 knot for this whole project. To make the spiral knot, first determine if you want the twist to go to the left or to the right. I wanted my twist to go to the right, so I'm going to start each knot on the left side. I'm taking the left green cord and making a triangle so the cord goes across the top of the white ones. Then the right cord is going to come over top of the straight section. Now that same right cord is going to go behind all the white cords and up through the triangle on the left, and then pull the green cords tight. I balled up my macrame because it was so long. This made it a little bit easier to work with. And then you repeat this until the spiral is as long as you want the shortest loop to be. Next, I need to attach the end of the spiral to the branch to create the loop. And I wanted it to mirror the first side with that lark's head knot. So to do this, take one of the white cords and wrap it around the branch and in between the loop. Then pull it to the right, wrapping it around itself. Then put the cord under the branch this time, leaving the loop. And the end of the cord will come down through the loop to create the knot. The difference here is you're only going to use 2 of the white cords on this end, and the other 2 will just hang down. I wasn't sure how to do the green ones just yet, so I moved on to my next color, and I'll show you shortly how I attach the colored cords on this end. The next color I'm using is Tobacco, and I got these macrame cords at Hobby Lobby. I really like the single twist macrame that they have. Okay, so for the colored cords, I wrapped them around the branch on either end of the 2 white cords. Then I pulled them to make one spiral knot just to hold it in place. I'm not sure if that was the best way to do this, but it was all I could think of. If someone else does macrame and knows better how to do this, please let me know in the comments. The next color I'm using is Brick, and repeating that same process that we did with the other 2. The last color will be white. Here's how the wall hanging is looking so far, but I wanted the area where the cords hang down on the right to be a little bit fuller. So I cut some additional cords to just tie onto the existing ones. Next, I want to add 2 loop rows of beads. One row of beads will be a little bit larger than the other. The last part of this hanging is to add some macrame feathers for another element to the design. I'm going to cut down 20 pieces of the macrame to be 7 inches long and do that for all 3 colors. Creating the feather is easy. I'm starting with the green. So you want to grab 2 green cords that are hanging down and move the rest of the cords out of the way. Then lay a 7-inch cord looped in half on either side of the openings facing each other. One of the cords will go under the straight cords and up through the loop on the right, and the second is going to go on top and down through the loop on the left. Then pull those tight, and repeat that with all of the green cords, and then with the other 2 colors as well. Except for the next color, you want to start it a little bit further down so they end up being staggered. Next, to make the feather fluffy, you want to comb out the cords so they're no longer twisted together. Then, using a rotary cutter, cut the macrame into a feather shape. I do this a few times, going back and forth, brushing out the macrame and shaping it with the rotary cutter until I like the way that it looks. Now, if you leave the feather like this, they tend to look a little floopy and sloppy once you hang it up on the wall. Macrame is a soft cord and wants to droop, so I picked up some of this Aleene's fabric stiffener spray to see if it would make the feathers hold their shape. I brushed the feathers out once more and then sprayed them. I let that dry and then I sprayed it again to make sure the macrame would hold its shape. And I did that on both sides of each feather. This was a long project, but I love the way it turned out. I'm debating whether or not I want to keep it for myself or list it for sale on my site. Next wall art project is inspired by a few different floral pieces I've seen. I'm using another 12 by 12 canvas and these lavender floral picks that I got from Hobby Lobby. These florals weren't too expensive like some can be at Hobby Lobby. They were $4.99 a piece, so when you get them on a half off day, that's not too bad. These were the exact silhouette I was looking for this project. So I cut the stems down into individual pieces. That way I could lay them out how I wanted.
In this dynamite castle, you will never be alone. Indigo sunset, it's the only way to go. I've been waiting for the fallout in the middle of the night. In this dynamite castle, you and me will be alright.
Once I had all the lavender laid out how I wanted, I glued the florals down with my Starbond super glue. I didn't want to use hot glue because I thought you would end up seeing that in the end, which isn't what I wanted. This part does take a little bit of time, but I didn't glue every little piece down, just enough so that it would stay in place. Next, I added some of the grass pieces along the bottom for some more dimension. Initially, I wanted this to be coated in plaster, but the more I thought about it, I thought the plaster would end up looking like a mess. Really, all I wanted was the whole piece to be one color, so I decided to spray paint it instead. I used the color Heirloom White, which is a warm, creamy off-white color. I had to give the florals several coats. The paint absorbs into the material of the florals, and I feel like it still could use another coat or two. But that's it for this one. It was pretty easy. The last of my Quikrete cement that was in this little bucket and cleaned it out. Then I took some pliers to remove that metal handle. I did have to wiggle it around a little bit before it got loose on one side, and then the second side just fell right out. I decided to cut the top portion of the bucket off that has those ridges on it. That part isn't necessary. I just wanted a cleaner look and to make it look less like a bucket. But you could also take some ribbon or rope or even fabric to cover that section if you choose to leave it on. I just used a utility knife and I had to make a few passes around the bucket before it cut all the way through. Next, I'm taking my hot glue to create dots all around the bucket. Again, you don't have to use hot glue here. You could use those dot stickers that the Dollar Tree sells or half-wood beads to get a similar look. If you do use hot glue, I learned a few things during this process. You want to make sure you hold the glue gun straight up and down. Don't tilt it at all because the glue will run and not keep a circular shape. And then because the bucket is slightly narrower at the top, when you lay it down, it's not level. So you want to put something under one end of the bucket to make it level and keep your hot glue from running and creating a disfigured circle. I let my trial first row of dots cool off and made my next row. I'm staggering the glue dots so I'll end up with a row of 4 dots, then a row of 3, and so on. The second row turned out much better, and since it's only hot glue, I was able to peel off the deformed ones to start over. I repeated this all the way around the bucket. It did take a little bit of time because I didn't want the glue to start running and had to wait a minute or two in between starting each new row. Once all the hot glue dots were dry, I took the bucket out to the garage to spray paint it. I want the main color to be this oil rubbed bronze, but since this was a bright yellow bucket, I didn't want to waste that color having to do several layers. So I first coated the bucket with a black primer. Then I only needed to add one coat of the oil rubbed bronze. I also sealed the bucket with a clear satin spray paint because the oil rubbed bronze was starting to scratch off easily. Next, I'm taking some of these wood rings from the Dollar Tree in 2 different sizes and hot gluing them onto the bottom of the bucket. I would have loved the rings to be all the same size, but I didn't have enough, and that's it for this bucket project. And I'm using this giant 2-foot by 8-foot white birch plywood that I had bought to use in Mason's bedroom makeover. But he had changed his mind, of course, and didn't want it as his desktop anymore, so today I'm using it to create a set of asymmetrical display shelves. I first cut the board down to a more manageable size piece with my circular saw. Then I ripped the board so I had 2 10-inch wide pieces. You will have about a 4-inch piece left over. So now I need to cut an angle on the top and the bottom of the boards. And at first I cut a 45-degree angle, then realized that was way too much and I didn't like how steep it was. I didn't want to cut down another part of the large board to start over, so I ended up making the shelves slightly shorter than I thought they would be. And I used my circular saw again to cut along my line. I cut the same angle on both sides of the board and hold on to those triangle pieces that get cut off. We're going to use them. After cutting the pieces down, I sanded the edges. My saw blade is a little bit old and needs replaced on the circular saw, so it was chewing up these edges. Next, I stained the back sides of my boards to match the front that I had already done for Mason's bedroom. I used Early American as the first layer and then transparent espresso on top. This is going to be the background part of the shelf that sits flat against the wall. Now I need to make the shelf. So I cut down another piece of the wood to be the same width as the background, and I made it 5 inches deep. Remember I said to hold on to those angle pieces that we cut off earlier? I'm going to use those now as the side of the shelf. I need them to be 5 inches deep as well, so I measured where 5 inches is and then drew a line from the top of the triangle down to that 5-inch mark. I'm only cutting down 2 triangles, one for each shelf. And these are going to go on opposing sides. You'll see how that looks here shortly, but first I need to glue all the parts together. I want there to be some contrast with the shelves, so I'm painting this part black. And I'm using the same color I used on my faux fireplace mantle build, Dark Secret by Behr in a satin finish. I painted everything except for the back that still needs to be glued and attached to the background board. Wood glue works best when you can attach the raw wood together. The background is already stained, but it'll still glue to that raw wood. However, trying to use wood glue on a satin finish latex paint may not have the best adhesion. Once the paint was dry, I glued the shelf onto the background, and for additional stability, since this is a display shelf, I added in 2 screws as well. I'm using cement to make a fall tree, and don't forget to wear your PPE when working with this material. I know I always get called out when I don't, so here it is. But I dumped a good amount of the cement powder into a plastic bowl. This bowl is designated for my cement projects because it will get ruined. Next, add some water to the dry powder and mix it up. Mine is more on the watery side this time. I wanted it to be pretty smooth on top. Once it's mixed, I grabbed a plastic nursery pot. This one is a 6-inch pot, and I scooped out some of the cement to place it in the bottom. Nursery pots have holes on the bottom of them, so I didn't want to just pour the cement in, since the top of the mix is where all of that water is sitting, and it would have run right out. So I grabbed this branch from my backyard, and I liked how tall it was, but I should have cut this U shape at the bottom of it off. I thought that the way I had placed it into the cement would be okay, because I had the tall section I'm using for the trunk of the tree centered, and that worked out great, but it does have a slight lean to it. Anyways, I used painter's tape to keep the branch in place where I wanted it and then let the cement dry. To create the tree, I picked up a few different floral picks from Hobby Lobby. Now, I know these can get pretty expensive. This tree cost me about $55 to make, and I already had the branch, cement, and nursery pot on hand, but if you had to buy everything and you couldn't even find a branch laying around, this would cost about $72. I understand that is not cheap, but in comparison to buying a similar tree from a retailer, you would spend about half that amount. I found a few trees at Hobby Lobby, and this cherry blossom one is comparable to the one I'm making in terms of its size. This one cost $110. And this fall tree is less than half the size of mine, and it cost $50. So faux trees are not cheap. Alright, so to make my vision of the tree, I first had to figure out how tall I wanted it. I grabbed 2 of the picks to hold them up and gauge the height. I didn't want it too tall, but at least taller than I am, and I'm only 5'1" for reference. Once I was good with where the picks would start, I used floral wire to temporarily hold them in place. I added 1 wire where the florals start on the pick, and then another wire at the very bottom so it wouldn't just wobble around. I'm using 2 different colors of this same type of pick to add some variety. Especially with this being a fall tree, I felt like this looked like the leaves were changing. I'm also going for a traditional but rich color palette this year with the burnt oranges, mustard yellows, sage greens, chocolate browns, and also adding in some creamy white to pull everything together. Okay, so once I have the picks on, I needed to cover up all of the stems and that floral wire that's holding them in place. This is where the brown floral tape comes into play. I wrapped the entire tree branch and floral picks so that it looks like one solid tree trunk. The key to working with this tape is stretching it as you wrap. The tape itself is not sticky, but once you stretch it and wrap it around itself, the tape will stick together. Wrapping the bottom of the tree was super easy, but once I got up to the picks, I wanted it to look like the picks were coming out as branches. So I would need to weave in and out of different sections. I tried to get a clip of this and film it to show you guys, but it was a little bit hard to see. And that's it for this tree. I put the nursery pot into a basket and covered the top of it with rocks so it doesn't fall over. I love how this turned out so much. This project is pretty easy. I'm taking 3 square-shaped mirrors. I'm not sure where I got these ones from, but Dollar Tree does sell mirrors like this, or you can usually find them in a multi-pack inexpensively at IKEA or Walmart. But I'm placing them face down for now so it's easier for you to see what I'm doing without that reflection. I'm creating a border with the Jenga blocks, and I wanted to make sure I could go all the way around the entire mirror surface without having to cut any of the blocks. That worked out for the outside, but then I wanted to add a row to cover where the mirrors meet, and I did have to cut down 2 blocks, 1 for each row. I tried using my miter shears to cut the block down, but since I have 0 hand strength, that wasn't working. I actually got the block stuck on the blade somehow, and I couldn't get it off or cut through it. So plan B, I got out the mini table saw. I love this saw, but man, I think I really need to play around with it some more. That small piece of the block just kept shooting right off and flying across the room. It was pretty forceful and kind of scary. Now we can start gluing everything together. I'm using this wood glue super glue that you can find at Dollar Tree. I love this glue. It starts to set up pretty quickly so you can keep on working, but also gives a much stronger bond than hot glue would. Next, I can add the mirror down on top of the blocks, and for this, I'm using E6000 to get a stronger hold. Before I add on those cross sections of the block, I wanted to add a little design to the mirrors. So I got out my rub-on transfers from IOD. This one is the Painterly Florals, and I'm going to use the pink roses. I cut out a couple of options and laid them out around the mirror. I love how easy it is to layer the IOD transfers. I've tried doing something similar with the Dixie Belle rub-on transfers, and they do not layer nearly as nicely. I had meant for the mirror to hang vertically, but I forgot about that when I was adding on the transfers, and I laid them out horizontally. It still looks super cute, but I wish I had remembered that part. It's really easy to add these rub-on transfers to the glass. You just peel off that backing and place it down wherever you want. All transfer books come with a burnishing stick, and you use this to rub over the transfer to apply them. You can see how beautifully the rose layered on top of the leaves on this section. The transfer looks like it came this way, like it is one cohesive piece. When I try to do this with the Dixie Belle transfers, you could see that leaf underneath of the flower, and it kind of changed the color of the flower where the leaf was under it. Once I had all the transfers on, I added the rest of the Jenga blocks to hide where those mirrors meet. And the last thing I did for this project was paint the frame. I was going back and forth debating if I wanted to paint it or leave it in the wood. I think the wood gave it a more contemporary look, while painting it gave it more of a shabby chic or cottagecore type of look. You could choose any color or stain you want for this part. I was pretty careful when adding the paint near the transfers, but for the rest of the frame, if I got it a little bit of the paint on the mirror, that's okay. It'll wipe right off with some water since the paint is water soluble. First up, I came across these pillar candle holders while scrolling the site. It says they were new about a month ago, but I don't see them on the site anymore. Anyways, as I was looking at them, I was thinking I could easily recreate this shape using a styrofoam cone and a circle, which I already have in my stash. At first, I just glued the cone right down on the circle. However, I realized I wanted to cut the top of the cone off a little bit so there was more surface for that circle to sit on top. Now, I know some of you don't like when I share my mistakes or what I would do different. All I'll say is this is a DIY channel, and DIY is not perfect. I will continue to share my trial and error process and being transparent in my videos to help those who do appreciate it from making the same mistakes as I have. Back to the DIY, since the Pottery Barn version is ceramic, I wanted to figure out how I could get the styrofoam to look smoother than it is. I had 2 different ideas to do this and used both since I'm creating 2 candle holders to see if one turns out better. On the taller one, I'm going to use plaster of Paris. I mixed up the powder and water using a 2-to-1 ratio until it was smooth. You only have a few minutes to work with this stuff, so I had to work pretty quickly. I thought I could get a smooth look by pouring it over the cone. This worked out pretty well. It is not perfectly smooth, but I was able to sand it down once it was dry. The second method I tried was joint compound. I didn't want to completely cover the cone with joint compound, but I added way too much at first. So I took my spatula and just kind of spread it over the surface to fill in all of those holes and removed all of the excess. Like I said, the plaster didn't turn out perfectly smooth, but it wasn't too bad. I sanded down both the plaster cone and the joint compound cone to get them smoother. Although you could also get a smooth surface by covering the cones with poster board and save yourself all of this time and effort. Next, I painted all of the pieces with white paint. Alright, now we can attach the circles back to the cones. I measured the sides this time to make sure I glued the cone down right in the center. Since this is a pillar candle holder, you want to make sure it's centered so the circle doesn't break off under the weight. Once I found the center, I marked it with a Sharpie and then I used my Starbond super glue to attach the pieces together. This gives them a really secure hold. Now to add the design, the Pottery Barn piece looked like watercolor, and I bought these watercolors from the Dollar Tree a while back. The blue in this kit wasn't the right shade that I was looking for, so I'm using another blue I had and mixed the black watercolor to get a deep blue. You want to add a lot of water to this paint to get that wash of color and not so saturated. Pro tip, if you need to add a straight line onto something, figure out how high you want that line to be. I'm using a paint container. And put your project on a turntable. Then you can hold your hand and the brush stationary and spin the object to get a perfect straight line. Then I added in the decorative pattern along the bottom. I like to use a pointed paintbrush here to get that variation in the lines a little bit easier. I'm not the best painter at things like this, but I just kept referencing the Pottery Barn version and did my best. Again, just make sure you have a lot of water in the paint, unless you want that more saturated look. I really like the uneven color. You could leave the candle holders just like this, they look beautiful, but the Pottery Barn version also had some paint splatter on them, which I wanted to add to mine as well. I wanted to make the blue darker for this part, so I added in even more black. But it doesn't look super different in the end. I wish it was a little bit darker. But I added even more water into the mix, and I used my finger to flick the watercolor onto the pieces. The additional water really helps it to flow off the brush nicely. Lastly for this project, I wanted to get that high gloss finish, so I sprayed it with a satin sealer first. I didn't have a gloss spray sealer and didn't want the watercolor to smear if I had used a brush. But then I went back over top with a gloss Mod Podge. For this project, I'm going to use my Cricut. Now, a Cricut is not necessary for this, so stick with me. If you can draw a leaf shape or have a leaf shape you can outline, you can use that. I wanted my leaf to look a specific way, and I'm not great at drawing, so I used my Cricut. It also doesn't matter what color vinyl you use. I was clearly not thinking during this step because I know vinyl doesn't stick to canvas. I've tried this before and it didn't work then either. So needless to say, I struggled here for a bit until I realized I should have used it as a reverse stencil instead of weeding it as if it were a decal. Eventually, I got the vinyl untangled and laid down. And all I'm using this for is to trace the outline of the leaf shape. I'm using a fine point micron pen to do this. Now that I have my leaf outline, I'm using a hot glue gun to once again trace that leaf shape. I want the image to be raised off of the surface of the canvas. I just took my time to do this and kept my hand moving. That way the glue would follow the line where I wanted it to and didn't puddle. I let the glue cool down so it got hard and then painted the entire canvas black. This color is Black Velvet by DIY Paint, and I like that it's a soft black and not too dark. Now for the fun part and bringing this piece to life, I'm going to use my gold leaf sheets to cover the leaf design and really make it pop. I use a specific metal leaf adhesive, but I've heard that you can use tacky glue. I keep meaning to try that method, but I haven't yet. I get my adhesive from Amazon and it's linked in my description box. I'm covering the entire surface of the leaf with the glue, and you want to be careful around the edges of the outline. I used a small paintbrush to make sure I didn't get the glue outside of the design. The gold leaf will stick anywhere that the glue touches. Once the leaf is covered with glue, set it aside to dry and become tacky for at least 30 minutes. Each adhesive has its own dry time, so just check what it says. Next, I'm taking my gold leaf sheets and I'm going to start laying them down on top of the tacky glue. I used my finger to rub the gold leaf down around the hot glue areas to make sure it was completely covered. Then I took any pieces hanging off of the design and not stuck down to the glue and placed them in areas where the gold leaf might have separated or cracked while pushing it down. I wanted to make sure the entire leaf surface is covered. And at this point, it's looking pretty messy. But then I rubbed my fingers around all the hot glue areas to make them pop out. the gold leaf is stuck down to all of the glued areas, I'm going to clean up all of the loose pieces with a soft, dry paintbrush. I wanted to make sure there was no gold leaf showing outside of the leaf design. There were a few little specks here and there, so I took a flat paintbrush and added a second coat of the black paint so it was nice and crisp. I thought I was going to stop here and be done, but wanted it to look a little more elevated and high-end. I picked up these balsa wood pieces from Hobby Lobby and going to use them to add a frame. This wood is super soft. You could even cut it with a sharp pair of scissors or miter shears, but I'm using my miter box. I wanted to stain the wood, but wasn't quite sure what color would look good, both with this type of wood and with the canvas design as well. So I took a scrap piece of the balsa wood to do some testing. I thought either the Special Walnut or Early American looked the best with the black and gold design. The others weren't quite right. I ended up choosing Special Walnut and stained all of the pieces before adding them to the canvas. I let the stain dry overnight and then hot glued them around the sides of the canvas. Now the balsa wood sticks out farther than the canvas, which I liked. I think it looks even more elevated and like a shadow box this way, but that's it for this one and I love it so much. This project is super easy, definitely the easiest one today. I picked up a pack of these little skull buckets from the Dollar Tree, and first I'm going to remove that handle on them. I'm going to make a set of ombre succulent planters, and they turned out so freaking adorable, I love them. The base color is going to be this terracotta paint by Folk Art in the color Pueblo. You can make this paint yourself by just adding some baking soda to it, and then you can use any color you choose. So the darkest skull is going to be the paint on its own. Then for the rest of the skulls, I added more and more white paint to lighten it. You'll see two skulls are painted with the full saturated color at first. At first I was going to do something different, so for the next color I did about 3/4 Pueblo, 1/4 white, then 50-50, and then 25-75. I also added in some baking soda as I added in more white so I didn't lose that texture. I put 3 coats of paint on in total, and for the last coat I stippled it on to make sure that you could see that terracotta or baking soda texture. Next, I went to Home Depot to pick up some mini succulents, and first off, they don't have a great selection this time of year when it's starting to get cold out, but I also find that Lowe's has a much better plant selection overall. I just happened to already be at Home Depot, but anyways, I found this cute succulent garden with a few different varieties and thought it was perfect for my little planters. I filled up the skulls about halfway with soil and then pulled the succulent garden apart to separate each plant, and then I placed one in each of my skulls. this project, I'm using one of these cylinder concrete forms. Now, I know this isn't exactly trash, but I've had it laying around in my garage for my plaster table DIY. You could also use a bucket or other cylindrical object to create the same thing. I cut the form down into 2 sections at different heights. And I'm gonna wrap the cylinders with these tile sheets that I picked up off the side of the road. Someone was just throwing them away. This is a pretty easy project. You just need some liquid nails to stick the tile sheets on. I put on a pretty healthy amount so that they stick well, and then you pretty much just have to plop it right down on the cylinder. You do want to make sure to press the tiles down well so that they adhere. The large cylinder I had to cover with a little bit more than 2 sheets, and the paper backing makes it easy to just cut them down. I wasn't able to fully cover either one with the tiles. There was a gap that wouldn't fit another tile, and I didn't want to cut the tiles themselves down, so I left it. We'll fill that in the next step. I let the liquid nails set up and dry, so next I need to fill in all the gaps with grout. I would have loved to do a contrasting grout color, maybe black or something dark, but I already had the snow white color on hand for my kitchen makeover. So I decided to just use this instead of spending more money. You can buy pre-mixed grout, but I didn't have that, so I needed to mix it myself. All you do is add water. I added way too much at first, forgetting you only need a small amount, so I strained a lot of it out. But once it was mixed to a thick paste, I let it sit for 3 minutes to absorb that water. Typically, you want to add grout with a grout float, but I couldn't find where mine was, so instead I used a putty knife, and that worked just as well. You also want to work in sections. Since a lot of the grout gets onto the tiles, you don't want to let it sit there and dry out for too long. So I took a wet sponge and I wiped down the tiles to remove any of that excess grout, and this also smooths out those grout lines. When I got to those large gaps, I just filled them in with the grout. I'll make sure that this part is the back and you hardly even notice it. I thought about adding a painted design to the tiles or some sort of artwork, but I couldn't decide what exactly to do. So I left them unpainted for now, but let me know in the comments if you have any ideas on what I should put on them. I think I'll incorporate that into a future video. I did paint the insides of the forms white so it didn't stick out like a sore thumb, and that's it for this one. Project is something you can leave out all year long. I bought this set of 6 chairs at the Goodwill bins a while back because I loved the variety of spindles on it. I want to use the 4 legs of this chair to create a lantern and use the spindles as the pillars. I've never seen anyone do this, but please let me know if you have because I thought it was such a great idea. And it's pretty easy to wiggle these chairs apart without damaging the spindles. The one downside is that you now have holes in the spindles where they were attached to the chair. So to fix that, I'm using a dowel to fill it in. Simply added wood glue to the hole, added in the dowel, and then used a thin flush cut saw to cut off the excess. The dowel size I had was a tiny bit too small for the hole, so then I used some wood filler to fill in the gaps. I think this particular wood filler was old or something because I didn't love how it was looking. I had added on 2 layers of this, letting it dry in between, and it would keep shrinking and not filling in this space entirely. So then I got out my joint compound and used that to fill in the rest of the gaps. This worked out much better. Next, I gave the spindles a scuff sand before painting them, just so the paint doesn't scratch right off of that slick surface. I also added a layer of Dixie Belle Slick Stick just for some added security. This is essentially a primer and very similar to the Zinsser 123 primer. Then I painted them in a grayish brown color called Prairie Gray. Now for the top and the bottom, I'm using a scrap 1x12 board and cut it down into two 10" by 10" square pieces. Since the spindles have so much detail, I want the top and the bottom to match that elegance and not just look like a basic piece of cut wood. Again, I've had these trim pieces left over from other projects in my stash. I'm going to use this beveled looking one around the bottom section. This is also going to conceal the bottoms of the spindles since they don't exactly cover the corners of the wood base. The trim is super easy to cut. You could use miter shears, but since I was already out in the garage, I decided to use the saw. Once I had the pieces cut down, I glued them down directly on top of the wood base. And for the top of the lantern, I wanted there to be a little bit more to it, so I cut down another 1x12 and made it an 8" square. This time I'm going to cut the same trim down and glue it directly around the side edges of the smaller wood square. And on the larger wood square, I'm using the spiral looking trim and that same beveled one stacked together. Except this time I'm flipping the beveled one upside down so the thin section is facing down. And this will mirror how I have it on the bottom. This step isn't necessary, but because I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to fill in all of the seams with wood filler. This just helps to make your project look more high-end and store-bought. I'm going to stain the wood, so I made sure to wipe off any excess wood filler as soon as I applied it, since it does not take the stain the same way that the wood itself does. And then I stained all of the wood with Early American. Before I can put all the pieces together, I need to trim down the spindle so that they're all the same height. Then I used wood glue to add the spindles to the base. I started with the bottom and added them right into the corners of the wood base. I let that dry before adding the top because the spindles taper in and I want to make sure it's centered. Then I flipped the lantern upside down and glued the top of the spindles. You want to pay attention here to make sure the wood grain is facing the same direction on both the top and the bottom. All that's left to do is to decorate this guy up. Like I said at the beginning, you could use this all year round. I'm just decorating for Christmas since we're heading into that time of year. For this next set, I looked around my craft room to see what I could combine together to make a mushroom with. I have a bunch of spindles and thought that would look super cute as the stipe, and then a Dollar Tree planter for the cap. Oh my gosh, how cute. I cut the spindle down a little bit, but I wish I would have made it taller and left that top part on. That's okay, I can always make another one. Next, I glued the planter to the spindle using my Titebond glue. Then I took the bottom of the spindle that I cut off and found this little bowl in my stash for the cap and glued those together as well. I am obsessed with this little one, you guys. Just wait until you see the final reveal. You could leave these ones just like this, they would be super cute, but I'm gonna make them even cuter. All right, I'm annoying myself gushing over how cute these things are, so let's move on. You have got to be kidding me. I dropped my favorite mushroom in that bowl, shattered. I was not scrapping this project, so I glued the broken pieces back together using my Starbond super glue. I wanted to paint the cap as well, and since it's a slick, shiny surface, try to say that 5 times fast, I'm using my Dixie Belle Slick Stick first so the paint doesn't scratch right off. Once that was dry, I painted the cap in Lichen by Fusion Mineral Paint. I love this color. Then I got out my white puff paint and added little dots all around the mushroom cap. When adding the dots, I didn't want to see those stiff peaks from lifting the bottle tip away, so I would swirl my hand in the bottle to help prevent that from happening. You can still see the peak a little here, but as it dried, that flattened and went away. I was trying not to make the dots too uniform, but I think it ended up looking exactly that way. This is my favorite little mushroom piece today. I love him so much, even with that cracked glass. Now, for the other spindle mushroom, I painted the planter Sandcastle by Dixie Belle. I had to give this one 3 coats of paint, and then I sanded it down lightly to try and remove some of those brush strokes. I wanted to bring out some of the details around the planter, so I got my DIY dark wax and used a little detail brush to add it in between all those lines around the pot. I also added the dark wax to the rim of the pot and over that little filigree detail. When adding the wax over the filigree, I held my paintbrush flat and not straight up and down. That way it only glided over those raised areas. I didn't want the wax to stay so dark, so after I added it all on, I went back over top of it with the Sandcastle paint to tone it down a bit. This mushroom does have a big hole in the spindle from when this was originally a chair. You could always fill that in with a dowel or something, but I just left it as is. The hole can be on the back. I am so excited to share this next one with you guys. When I did my deck makeover, I bought a bunch of flowers and they always come in those little plastic containers. I was determined to come up with a project to reuse those rather than throw them away. I'm gonna turn these into pillar candle holders, so I first glued 2 of the containers together with the bottoms against each other. Now you'll see I only have 3 containers here, but I ended up using 5 in total, so the 2 that I just glued together will be the shorter of the 2. Then I painted the containers a light medium tan color called Sandy Blonde by DIY Paint. I scoured my craft room trying to figure out what to do with these, and nothing was quite making sense or it wasn't going to turn out right. Then finally I saw these Dollar Tree hats that I bought last year, and this was perfect. You can easily take these hats apart by snipping the thread where it ends on the brim, then simply pull the ribbon until the hat comes apart. Once you have the hat pulled apart into one long ribbon, there's also an invisible thread running through the whole thing. You also want to pull this out. I ended up using one hat for this project and I still had a little bit of the ribbon left over. Now I'm going to start wrapping the ribbon around the containers. I didn't want it to have a spiral look, although that probably would have made it look cleaner around all four sides. But instead I wanted it to have rows of the ribbon. So I glued it down and I would cut the end of each row before starting the next one. Each row that I added, I slightly overlapped the one below it. That helped the ribbon form to the tapered shape of the containers. And that's why I struggled so much figuring out what to cover these with, because the shape tapers in and then back out. So you can't just wrap it with something solid. This worked out perfectly and it covered up the space where those two containers meet. On the second pillar, I added one more container on top, and this time the two openings facing each other. This section was a little bit more challenging to add the ribbon because it didn't want to stay straight, but it worked out and they look so good. For the top and the bottom of the candle holders, I'm using these wood squares from Hobby Lobby, and I have two different sizes. I sanded them down because the edges are pretty rough, and it's a little hard to tell in this clip, but the one on the left has not been sanded yet. Then I wanted to do some stain testing. I've never used a pre-stain and decided to test it out on the bottom of the base piece. The top half of it has pre-stain and the bottom does not. You can see it really does make a difference in how evenly the stain is applied. I also have two different color stains on here. The left side is natural, which just enhances the natural color of the wood, and then the right side is a very light coat of golden oak. I wanted to keep this piece light and decided on the natural using the pre-stain underneath. As soon as I laid all the wood pieces out together, I could tell they were made from two different types of wood. I really loved the tone of those larger ones, and the smaller ones looked a lot more yellow, which I didn't love. So I coated all of them with the pre-stain, and then I thought I might be able to match the tone of the smaller ones to the bigger one. I first added that natural stain, and then a tiny little dab of the golden oak for a wash mixed in with the natural. That wasn't working, and I played around with other stain colors, but I was just making it look worse. So I abandoned that and just used the natural like I originally planned. I let the stain dry overnight and then I glued two of the smaller wood pieces together. This is going to be the top, so I wanted it to be a little bit more chunky looking. You just want to make sure that the wood grain is facing the same direction when you glue them together. Next, I hot glued the containers down to the wood pieces. The larger one is on the bottom and then the two smaller ones on top. Again, make sure that the wood grain is going in the same direction. And that's it for this guy. I love how they turned out, and you would never know they were made from plastic nursery pots. Project, I'm making a pumpkin trio, which you can style individually or together. I'm going to show you all three before we look at the final reveal. For the first one, I picked up this giant wood pumpkin cutout from Hobby Lobby, and you can see here just how large it is in comparison to the Dollar Tree ones. And at 40% off, it is certainly worth it for the price. I'm going to whitewash the surface just so it blends in better with what we're going to do with it. My white paint was also starting to dry out, so I really needed to water it down. I'm going to use more of the joint compound that I used earlier in this video. I saw a YouTuber named Angel Nicole do this in a recent video, and I thought it looked so cool. She did this on a circle, but I wanted to do a pumpkin. Anyways, you take the joint compound on a pointed palette knife and then spread it onto the surface of your project. And you want to keep doing this over and over, overlapping the lines, which will create a weave type of pattern. Typically on my channel, I just dive headfirst into all of my projects. Many of the things that I make are being done for the first time live on camera. There's no practicing ahead of time. But for this one, I really wanted to get the texture right, so I actually took a scrap piece of wood to make sure I understood the concept first. And I'm so glad I did, because look at how the left side compares to the right. It is so much better. So for the real thing, I wanted to color the joint compound so it had a more neutral beige color instead of the off-white. I mixed in some Apple Barrel acrylic paints in the color Warm Buff, Khaki, and Territorial Beige. Okay, so you're going to see the pumpkin is stained. That's because I had started adding the joint compound on and then realized my lines were super crooked. Instead of continuing down that path, I scraped it all off to start over. This time I drew a line down the center to follow it and keep it straight. I also learned that it worked best to build up a decent amount of the joint compound on the back of your palette knife, scrape the edges to keep it in that triangular shape. That helped keep the design looking uniform. You also want to start almost off of the object. I'm doing something different with the stem, so I started on the stem, then I can scrape off where I don't want it. But you need to start there to keep that full design. Then you just keep layering on the joint compound, one right on top of the previous section that you did. Now, once you get to the end of the first row, flip your project upside down. Then you create 2 rows, one on either side of the first row, so that they're going in the opposite direction. Again, this is going to create that weave-looking design. I let the joint compound dry overnight and then sanded up the edges to clean them up. For the stem, I'm taking my brown 2mm macrame and going to wrap it around the whole thing. I'm using my detail tip hot glue gun here since the macrame is so thin, I don't want the glue seeping out and looking like a mess. Now, before I show you it all staged, let's make the rest of this trio. The second one is super easy. I'm using a Dollar Tree pumpkin, and I drew a line about 3/4 of the way up. Then put a piece of painter's tape over that line. I'm going to stain the top section the wood. I'm pretty sure I used the color Special Walnut, but I can't quite remember. I let the stain dry and then remove the tape, which is so satisfying. Then I'm taking some marble contact paper that I've had in my stash to cover the bottom portion of the pumpkin. I like to peel back the top of the paper backer just a little bit to get it started. That way the whole thing doesn't start sticking to my project before I have the top lined up nice and straight. Then I slowly start to peel off the backing while smoothing the contact paper down on top at the same time. And you'll notice I did not cut the paper to fit the shape perfectly. I left enough hanging off of the back, and I'll cut it a little bit closer once it's adhered to the wood. Then I cut slits all around the edges so I can wrap that contact paper over the sides. This is going to look more finished than if you didn't have the edges covered. Lastly for this one, I'm adding a strip of faux leather ribbon to cover where the contact paper ends. This ribbon will show every lump and bump under it, so if you use hot glue, you want to spread it out thin and not put too much on. Now for the last piece of this trio, I'm using another Dollar Tree cutout with the acorn. This thing was pretty warped and bends so easily since it is super thin, so be careful not to snap it right in half. I drew a line across the top where the cap of the acorn would be, and I'm going to stain the top of this one as well. I think I used English chestnut on this one since it's a little bit darker. And I didn't tape it off this time since the line is curved and the bottom is going to be covered. For the bottom portion of the acorn, I found this faux leather ribbon at Hobby Lobby, and this is actually what sparked the idea for this trio. It's funny how the simplest of things can cause my wheels to spin and come up with an idea like this. But the width of the ribbon was perfect. I wasn't able to wrap this one around the edges, but that's okay. I'll show you what we do there in a little bit. I blindly traced where the acorn cap turned and cut that portion off. Then I used hot glue to attach the leather to the acorn. I added the hot glue on section by section so it didn't cool down too much and show any lumps. I cut the excess off with an X-Acto knife to get nice and close to that edge. Now on the edges, since I couldn't wrap the leather, I took a black Sharpie and colored the edges all the way around. This detail probably isn't too noticeable in the end, but it's things like this that I think elevate your projects to make them look more high-end. Lastly for this one, to hide the seam of the leather, I'm adding these half-wood beads. I did leave a small space between the beads. This allows room for error if they don't fit perfectly across the section that you need, and it's harder to tell where there's a smaller or larger gap. And now my trio is complete. I love all of these individually and especially all together with the varying textures they each have. I found this beautiful green striped fabric at the Dollar Tree, and this is perfect for me as green is my favorite color. It is a little bit wrinkled once you open the fabric up, and I had got this Cricut mini heat press recently. Don't ask me why I bought this a couple of months ago. I did not need it. I had no use for it. I had no projects in mind that I needed to use it on. However, it was an impulse purchase and I bought it. So here we are. But it came in super handy when I needed to iron out this piece of fabric. I'm going to be taking these embroidery hoops that I scored at the Dollar Tree. I could not believe it when I found these. I was so excited, but I'm placing them on top of my fabric and I wanted the sections of the stripes to be a little bit different on each embroidery hoop. So once I got the placement right, I just took my scissors and roughly cut them out. Next, I need to add the fabric to the embroidery hoop, so all you have to do here is unscrew that little top piece, place your fabric over the solid embroidery hoop ring, and then place the one with the screw right down on top of it and make sure your fabric is nice and snug. When you have a striped pattern or something similar, you want to make sure that your stripes are not warped and don't pull that fabric too taut. Now, here's where I kind of made a mistake. So I'm gonna be adding a stamp to a couple of these fabric hoops. And I knew I should have added the stamp before adding the fabric to the hoop, but I didn't do that. So here's the stamps I'm gonna be using. It's the Birds and the Bees by IOD. I was so excited when they came out with these. I ran and picked them up right away, and this is the first time that I've actually gotten to use them. So I picked out 2 of the birds that I liked, and I'm gonna use those on 2 of the larger embroidery hoops. But before I add the stamps on again, I'm cutting down the fabric and then I hot glued it down to the back to make sure it wasn't going anywhere, and it wasn't visible from the front. This is not how you typically finish the back of an embroidery hoop. I know that, I'm well aware. This is just the easiest way that I thought to do it. So next I'm hot gluing my embroidery hoops together in the placement that I want this little wall art piece to be. If you want this piece to be permanently held together, I would use a stronger adhesive than hot glue. I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep this layout or if I would mix it up a little bit in the future or take them apart entirely and use it as something different. So I only used hot glue here, but just know it will peel off because these are plastic embroidery hoops. Now I'm finally taking my stamps and adding them to the fabric. I did place a bucket underneath of the fabric embroidery hoop, so there was a flat surface right underneath of that fabric. I also don't have one of those acrylic blocks that you're supposed to put these kind of stamps on in order to handle it a little bit easier. But I applied my Craft Smart from Michaels permanent black ink all over my stamp, and then I'm pressing it down where I wanted it on my fabric embroidery hoop. Now, because I didn't place it down while the fabric was still on a flat tabletop surface, the stamp came out a little bit muted. I still love the way it looks. It looks a little bit more aged, but it could have looked a lot more crisp and bright. Regardless, I love the way this piece turned out. Next project doesn't exactly have trash in the traditional sense, but I had a broken chair that my mom gave me to use the spindles on, and that's what I'm considering the trash here, because otherwise the chair would have been thrown away. I want to use the more decorative spindles from this chair, and I'm cutting off the broken part with a flush cut saw. I knew I wanted to sand the varnish off of these spindles, so I started out doing that by hand, just using some 80 grit sandpaper. Sanding spindles is probably one of my least favorite crafting activities. This takes so long to do. I did end up taking them out to my garage to use my electric sander. I got the majority of the old finish off, but it was still stuck in between all the detail areas. I decided to move on because I want to bleach the wood and thought the bleach might help lighten those areas. I poured a little bit of the bleach into a container and then painted it onto the spindles. This really didn't do anything to the areas that had the original stain on them, so I ordered some sanding drum attachments for my Dremel, and I used those to get the remaining stain off. I'm making a plant stand here. I know, I am always making plant stands and planters, I just can't help myself, but I'm taking this Dollar Tree basket and I'm gonna pour some cement into it to make the stand. There were 3 little tabs inside of the bucket that were evenly spaced, and that made it super easy to figure out where my 3 spindle legs needed to go. I marked the edge of the bucket with tape since those tabs are going to end up getting covered with the cement. Next, I went out to the garage, and I've heard you guys in the comments, today I am wearing the proper PPE. Yay! I'm using this fast setting cement. I prefer Quikrete, but my store was out of it. So I dumped some of the powder cement into my plastic mixing bucket along with some water and began to mix it up. Then I poured the cement mixture into the bucket. You only have about 5 minutes to work with this before the cement starts to set, and you want to make sure to tap the bucket or whatever form you're using to get out any bubbles that might be trapped. I added one of my spindle legs into the cement and made sure that the part of the spindle that would have been hidden inside of the wood chair was the part that I stuck in the cement. I quickly realized I needed something to determine how far in from the edge I wanted each of them to sit. So I grabbed some Jenga blocks and taped them to the edge, and that was the perfect depth. I put the spindle back in and taped it to hold it in place. Then as I added in the next spindle, I used my level to make sure they were going to sit right on the ground. And once all of the spindles were in place, I let the cement dry overnight. The next day, I removed the tape from the spindles and the cement from the bucket. It was surprisingly easy to remove. I just hit the sides a few times to try and loosen it. I have no clue if that actually did anything, but let's just say that it did. I completely forgot that cement takes on the finish of its form. I knew that resin did that, but because the bucket had a glossy surface, the cement came out with a glossy surface as well. I was a little bit confused on why it had a marble-like look and thought that the whole thing would have turned out lighter, but I took it inside and the next day when I looked at it again, to my surprise, the whole thing got lighter. And I love this marble-like look on the top. I also chose the bucket I did because of the lines around the bottom. I knew the cement would pick that up well, and I just absolutely love how it turned out. There are a few holes from the bubbles, but overall it looks awesome. Project is something I wanted to make out of necessity. My husband and I bought a new bed recently and he built a wood frame for it. Now I'm only 5'1" and the frame he built is very tall off of the ground. I love having a taller bed, but needed something to help this short girl get in and out easily. I was using a cheap little plastic stool that I've always had around the house, but wanted to build a step stool for myself to match the bed a little bit better. I'm taking a scrap 2x12 board and cut it down to 14 inches. This is going to be the sides of the step stool, so you need 2 of them. And the easiest way to cut 2 boards the exact same size is to stack the first cut on top of the next board. Make sure that the end is flush and then slide the wood until the top cut piece hits your saw blade, and then remove that top board and cut the second piece. Next, I took a 2x10 and cut 2 24-inch pieces. These are going to be the steps. Now I need to cut a notch out of the 2x12 boards that are 14 inches long. Like I said, this is going to be the side of the stool and it's going to have 2 steps. So I placed one of the step boards on top to see where I need to cut. The first step is going to be 4 inches off of the ground. So I measured 4 inches up from the bottom of the board, and then I drew a line up to that first mark I made of how far in the step will sit. Then I cut the notch out with my circular saw and repeated that on the second side. This stool is coming together so well, but once I put the step on to make sure that it all fits, I noticed there was a little overhang on the front. So I marked where the board sits so I can cut that off. Next, I'm adding in some pocket holes. I don't want to see screws on the outside, so this way they will be hidden. Now comes the fun part. I'm gonna give this wood some color by burning it. I'm using a butane torch to do this, and burning the wood is another way to make that grain stand out. Since my husband burned the wood of our bed frame, I wanted to do the same here so that they match. I did make the stools a little bit different though, and burned it more than the bed frame for a little bit less contrast. But this is personal preference. You can burn the wood as much or as little as you like, or not at all. Stain works too. After all the wood was burned, I'm taking a wire brush to knock off any of that loose ash. I really loved the color of the wood after I did the wire brush, but I needed to seal the wood too. I'm a little bit disappointed that once I added the polyacrylic, it made the tone much darker. I think that may have been because I had used a satin sealer. It was the only finish that I had on hand, so I wonder if using matte would have darkened it a little bit less. But now it's time to put it all together. This was a little bit tricky because of the notches in the sideboards. I had to hold the sides on top of the step and screw them down together this way. That's it for this stool, and I am so happy with how it turned out. The length and the height are perfect for helping me to get in and out of bed. I'm starting out with two different size wood circles. The smaller size is from Dollar Tree and the larger one's from Hobby Lobby, but you can see how rough and jagged the edges of these wood pieces are, and I want to stain them. So in order to get a nice, even and clean looking stain, you want to sand them down first. I have this square sheet palm sander that works great on things like this. Since the sheet of the sandpaper wraps around the front edge of the sander, I can easily get into the grooves of the circle and make sure it is all sanded nice and smooth. And I'm using a 220 grit sandpaper here. See how much better that looks? I always recommend to sand wood before you stain it, and you will get a much better result. I'm going to use the color Early American, and I gave all 4 wood circles 1 coat. Now for the skulls, I'm using 5 of the larger plastic skulls from Dollar Tree, and first I'm going to give the surface a scuff sand. I'm going to spray paint these ones, and I don't want the paint to just scratch right off. You just need to rough up that surface a little bit, don't go crazy here. I'm using a 100 grit sandpaper. I want to stack the skulls to make 2 staggered pillars. The first skull will sit on the larger wood circle as the base, and for the larger one, I'm using 3 skulls. I want them all to be facing a different direction so it looks a little bit twisted. So to stack the skulls and hold them in place, I'm using a dowel. Here I'm showing a very thin dowel, but I would recommend something much thicker. My pillars are pretty wobbly, and I went back later to add a thicker one, which you'll see here shortly. I added a generous amount of hot glue between the skulls to hold them in place, and then it's time to spray paint. I'm using a flat black spray paint as the primer, and then I'm going in with Oil Rub Bronze by Behr spray paint. And you can see my struggles here. The skulls are so light that the force of the spray paint is knocking them right over. I ended up getting some double-sided tape to hold them down while I painted. Once the spray paint was dry, I'm going to glue the skull down to the wood base. I wanted the glue to dry quickly so I could keep working, but didn't only want to use hot glue. So I'm using E6000 as well as the hot glue. That way I get a stronger, long-lasting hold with the E6000, and you'll notice I am not mixing the glues together. You want to keep them separate for the best adhesion. For the top, I'm using the smaller wood round circle, but there's a bump on the top of the skull and it's not going to sit right. So I got out my hot knife and I cut a circle out on the top of the head so that it sits better. I did have to keep playing around with it to get it as level as I could, but once I did get it as level as I could, I'm using the E6000 hot glue again to attach the smaller wood circle to the top of the pillar. And then I did the same process for the second skull pillar. So once I had it all together, I put a candle on top and realized just how wobbly it was. So I grabbed a much thicker dowel to swap out for that smaller one. Good thing I had only used hot glue here and it pulled right apart. So I cut my dowel down and I also made it a little bit taller this time to make sure that it goes all the way through to the top of the top skull for full stability. I put a generous amount of hot glue on the bottom of the dowel as well to hold it in place on the bottom, and then stacked my skulls back on top. I also added a healthy portion of hot glue in between each layer, making sure both the dowel and the skull were adhered together. This time it is much sturdier. I've even seen people use metal paper towel holders from the Dollar Tree as a support, but that's it for this one. You could use them as a pillar candle holder, plant stand, or even put little jars of candy on top for Halloween. Starting out with a large vessel, and I don't love the straw-like material that's wrapped around the top of it. It's also broken in an area, so I'm gonna remove this. I was able to easily cut through it with a utility knife and start peeling it off. Most of the straw came off with the help of a multi-tool to scrape it. However, there are some areas where the adhesive was pretty strong and I wasn't able to get everything off. I needed to break down the adhesive in order to get all that residue off. So to do this, I got out my goof off and a microfiber towel. I soaked the towel in the goof off and let that sit for a few minutes to break down the glue. I always forget to move my camera arm when I do shots like this. That's that little black thing that's hanging down and keeps covering my head. Goof off has had some time to soak in and break down that glue. I was able to scrape it away much easier now. Eventually I did get out a razor blade, which worked a little bit better than the multi-tool, but I had to work my way around section by section, letting it soak and then scrape it off. If you need to do something like this, make sure you work in a well-ventilated room. I had all of my doors and windows open. All of Atelier one I was inspired by had these decorative twists all around it. So I thought my 4mm macrame cord would give that same look. I used hot glue and added about 6 pieces on, going all the way down. Next, I'm going to paint the surface, and I want there to be texture to it, just like the old world vessels of my inspiration. A few months ago, I did a lime wash wall in my kitchen, and I made my own lime wash paint. I'm using what I have left as my base coat, which is going to add a very natural looking texture to the vessel. I started out using a sponge brush, but I actually really don't like working with these sponges at all. Every time I think I'll give it another shot, I regret it. I kept going with this first layer, but ditched the sponge brush for the second. Anyways, I was applying the lime wash in almost a stippling motion at first, but again, I wasn't loving that. So after I got the whole thing covered, I went back over and kind of smoothed it out. I didn't want to lose the texture and pattern, so I did this unevenly and in crosshatch motions. Lime wash paint dries about 90% lighter than how it goes on, and I thought it was a little bit too light. So I got out my natural pigment and added in some more color to it using natural umber. This time I'm also using a chippy brush to apply it, and I prefer this one any day over the sponge brush. It also gives more texture. I continued with that crosshatch pattern to apply the lime wash all over the vessel. While I love the rope that I added on the macrame because you can see that twist, which is really what the inspiration piece had. It was a lot larger, but you could really see that detail of the twisted look on the Olive Atelier pieces. So I have this Prima redesigned by Prima mold here. And it has a similar like twist piece, or I could do a couple of different ones, but I think that's what I'm gonna go with. And I think I wanna add that on. It's gonna be a little bit bigger for the size vessel that we have here. And I think because once I added paint, the like lime wash paint over top, and we still have more work to do in making this look more aged, this is just gonna show up a lot better because the twist is kind of starting to fade in some areas as the paint is building up on top of it. So I think that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna take these off. I just hot glued them on. Hopefully it's easy to just take them off, remove them. We are going to use some air dry clay and a mold, reapply it. We're gonna have to let that dry, unfortunately, and then go from there. Macrame off the vessel, smoothed out where the hot glue was, and now I need to make all of the air dry clay twist pieces to add on. I'm using my DAS air dry clay. I really like this brand. Sculpey is another really good option, and then this redesigned by Prima silicone mold. You always want to dust a mold with cornstarch before adding in the clay so it doesn't stick and you get a clean design. These molds are a little different from the IOD ones I like to use since they do not have that micro rim, which allows you to easily remove any excess clay. So for molds like this, I take a palette knife or something like it and run it along the top of the mold to remove the clay. I didn't get a great clip of how I was adding these pieces on, but I cut each end at an angle, and that way it was a little easier to connect them together. Then I used my Titebond glue to attach them to the vessel. I added them on wet, otherwise they would have dried flat. There was some slight shrinkage while the clay dried, but I was able to fill that in with a tiny bit of spackle, and you can't even tell clay has dried. You can't even tell where I added in some spackle to fill in any gaps. Now I need to paint the clay sections with the lime wash paint so it all has that same color. This was actually pretty difficult. The lime wash did not want to get into all of the clay dents and divots. I kept trying different style paintbrushes to get it on. So when you use lime wash paint, each layer you apply slightly changes the color and also the texture of the surface. Since I was getting this layer of the lime wash on the sections that were already painted as well, I went back over the whole thing randomly applying the lime wash so you wouldn't see those stripe sections around the clay where it was a little bit darker. I don't think this part mattered because we're gonna cover up the whole thing again anyways. However, you could also stop here, and I think it looks beautiful just as it is. It was just too gray for me and didn't have enough age to it, so I went on to the next step. I'm using some acrylic paints and a sponge to layer on and get more of that aged patina. The first color I'm using is Cinnamon by Folk Art. The Olive Atelier pieces I was referencing had a terracotta looking base with some light aged areas on top. Another feature of lime wash is when it gets wet, the paint is reactivated. At first I was trying to avoid this and not wet my sponge too much, but I actually really liked how the areas were looking where I had wet the sponge a little bit more. Making anything look aged is a trust the process type of project. Projects like this usually always look kind of crazy and like a hot mess before they look good. There were plenty of times where I was seriously questioning what I was doing and I thought I had ruined the vessel. But I kept going, kept layering on the paint until I was happy with how it looked. It was difficult to get the sponge into all of the little crevices of the clay section, so I would use a detail brush or a chippy brush to apply the paint where needed. As I moved down the vessel, I started to add in some darker areas using Nutmeg and Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel. This started to add more depth to the piece. And again, that lime wash base layer helps to add some really interesting effects to the paint as it all dries. could stop here as well, and this version is also beautiful and looks like aged terracotta, but it was a little bit too orange for me. So I decided to add in some more light tan over top. It really doesn't look tan as it dries, it's starting to look more gray, but I think this helps tone it down and bring it a little bit closer to my inspiration. I kept going back and forth with the darker and the lighter colors in hopes that it all melts together and look a little less splotchy than the previous version. While I liked how aged it looked, it was a little bit too busy. However, I didn't want any area to look too solid of one color, so I also took my sponge with the brown colors and very lightly dabbed it over here and there just to tie everything together. Now, you guys have to tell me which version you prefer out. Even though I was really questioning how this would turn out, I'm so glad I kept on going with it. It is stunning and really gives that old world and aged vibe. You can style this simply like I have here with just an olive branch, or add in some pampas grass for even more of that boho look.